the Navy SEALs never noticed her. For 2 years, setting up their targets, calibrating their equipment, maintaining their range, she was just background noise in their world of precision and power. Until that scorching desert morning when Lieutenant Kane decided to humiliate the quiet technician. With a cruel smile, he tossed her his rifle. "Let's see what you can do, range girl." What happened next froze every elite operator on that line. Range 7 at Fort Carson sat in the middle of the Nevada desert, a facility where only the most elite came to train. In the early morning hours, before the sun even appeared on the horizon, Sarah Mitchell quietly arrived at her work area. 32 years old, medium height, with dark brown hair always arranged in a neat bun, Sarah had been living this routine for the past 2 years. Arriving in an old Ford pickup, Sarah received only a nod at the security gate. After 2 years, she had become invisible like a piece of furniture. The soldier at the gate didn't even remember her name most of the time. Every morning brought the same silence, the same methodical approach. She would remove her precision tools from her bag, check the target systems one by one, take distance measurements with millimetric precision, and calibrate wind sensors. Her hands worked with machine-like accuracy, adjusting every detail to perfection. Of course, very few people noticed this. There was an impressive efficiency in Sarah's work style. She would precisely adjust every frequency change, optimize target quality, and minimize distance errors. The movement of her fingers over the tools was so fast and precise that it seemed as if she was born to do this job. When adjusting distant targets, she could make precise adjustments to metal plates 2,000 meters away as if they were right next to her. The other workers at the range were usually men, and they didn't take Sarah very seriously. To them, she was just the quiet technician. In 2 years, perhaps no one had heard her say more than 50 words total. Some actually thought she was mute. "Morning, Ghost," said Sergeant Mike Torres as he passed by Sarah. Torres was one of the center's most experienced operators, with 12 years of experience. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. "Still playing the silent game?" Sarah nodded slightly but said nothing. This situation amused Torres. "I swear she's like a robot," he said to another operator, Corporal James Wilson. Wilson was younger, 26 years old, with only 2 years of experience. 2 years here never heard her say more than yes or no. Wilson laughed. "Maybe she can't handle real communication. Just good with technical stuff. My dad was the same way. He was a car mechanic, could talk to engines, couldn't talk to people." Sarah heard these conversations but didn't react. Her eyes on her screens, her ears on the surrounding sounds, her fingers on the tools. Always alert, always listening, always analyzing. But no one was aware of this. At 7 o'clock, the range began its daily routine. While Sarah checked the target systems, other technicians prepared equipment, and weapons specialists reviewed that day's training program. "Mitchell," shouted Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the range's senior instructor. "Calibrate the 800-meter targets. Today, we have basic shooting training for newcomers." Sarah nodded and got to work. 800 meters was the standard distance for new operators. Not easy, but not impossible either. While setting up the targets, she ensured each one was perfectly aligned. She calculated wind direction, compensated for temperature changes, and evaluated lighting conditions. At 9 o'clock in the morning, SEAL Team 7 arrived for training. Led by Lieutenant Marcus Kane, 6 elite operators spread across the range. Kane, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, was a man with extreme self-confidence. Behind him were 8 years of Special Forces experience, 3 times in Afghanistan, twice in Iraq, and 1 classified mission. The 5 men on his team had similar backgrounds. Sarah continued working quietly as always. First 800 meters, then 1,200 meters, and finally she placed targets at 1,600-meter distances. She adjusted each one with millimetric precision, secured the tripods, and checked the angle of the target plates. She measured wind conditions, calculated temperature changes, and noted humidity levels. "Torres," Kane called out while taking his rifle from his shoulder. "Are these target systems calibrated today?" "Yes, sir." The technician checks them every morning. Mitchell is reliable, never causes problems. Kane turned his eyes to Sarah. For the first time, he looked at her carefully. The quietly working, head-down, nearly invisible woman. She was the only civilian personnel he worked with, but they had never spoken until now. "What's her name?" "Sarah Mitchell, sir. She's been working here for 2 years. Very quiet, but does her job well." Kane nodded and focused on training. The first distances went smoothly. Perfect groups at 800 meters, his men easily hitting targets. At 1,200 meters they struggled a bit more but still achieved satisfactory results. But when they reached 1,600 meters, things became seriously difficult. The desert heat had increased. It was 10 o'clock and the sun had become intensely hot. The wind showed variability, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, sometimes not blowing at all, sometimes blowing strongly. Mirage effects blurred the targets, making the distant metal plates appear to waver. Kane focused on the target through his scope, held his breath, and pulled the trigger. The bullet passed to the left of the target. The second shot went to the right. The third shot went low. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Conditions are too variable. The wind isn't constant." Sarah, continuing to work from a distance, was watching Kane's shots. Her hands on the tools, but her eyes and ears on Kane's shooting routine. She could very clearly see what the problem was. The wind calculation was wrong. Kane was only calculating the wind at his own position, not taking into account the changing wind conditions along the bullet's flight path. He hadn't accounted for temperature gradient. He hadn't compensated for mirage effect. Moreover, the desert air density was different, very different from sea level. But of course, she couldn't say anything. Her job was to set up targets, not give shooting advice. As a civilian technician, her boundaries were clear. Kane's frustration was growing. Failing in front of his team was damaging his ego. The other team members were facing similar difficulties. Only the team's most experienced sniper, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, could be relatively successful, and even that was very difficult. "This is ridiculous," Kane said, putting his rifle down. 1,600 meters is impossible in these conditions. "Sir," Rodriguez said carefully, "maybe there's a problem with target calibration, or the wind sensors are giving wrong readings." Kane's eyes turned to Sarah. For the first time, he focused directly on her with an angry look. "You!" he called out, raising his voice. "Technician!" Sarah raised her head and made eye contact with Kane. Fear appeared in her eyes for a moment, but she immediately brought it under control. "Are these targets properly adjusted?" Sarah nodded, meaning yes. "Are you sure? Because our shots are going to random places. You've been working here for 2 years. If you can't set up targets properly, what are you doing here?" Sarah nodded once more. She knew the problem wasn't with the targets, but with the shooting technique. But it wouldn't be appropriate for her to say this. Moreover, since she never spoke, it would be very difficult for her to explain. Kane was getting increasingly angry. Failing in front of his team, especially not being able to hit targets set up by a civilian technician, was dealing heavy blows to his ego. "You've been working here for 2 years," he said. approaching Sarah and making his voice threatening. "Have you ever fired a shot?" Sarah nodded slightly, meaning no. Kane grinned. "Of course. You've probably never even held weapons. How can you work at a shooting range and not know how to use guns?" The other operators were watching the situation. These kinds of confrontations were usually sources of entertainment, putting some pressure on civilian personnel, reminding them of the hierarchy. "I'm curious," Kane continued, raising his voice even more so others could hear. "You set up so many targets. I wonder if you actually know how to shoot." Sarah remained silent. She lowered her eyes to the ground. Her instinct was to run, but she seemed rooted to the spot. "Here's what I think," Kane continued, grinning. "Maybe to gain experience, you should actually learn how to shoot. Maybe then you'll set up targets correctly too." These words made the other operators laugh. Sarah's cheeks reddened, but she maintained her silence. The defense mechanism she had developed over 2 years, become invisible, don't react, let it pass. Kane took his rifle from his shoulder, a custom-made Macmillan TAC 338, worth $15,000, with the latest technology scope, carbon fiber stock, special sight system. It was one of an operator's most valuable tools. "Here you go," he said, extending the rifle to Sarah with a mocking smile. "Show us what you can do." Sarah's eyes locked onto the rifle. She felt that something she had hidden, concealed, and tried to forget for 2 years was about to be revealed. Her heart raced. Her hands began trembling more. "Sir," Torres said, trying to intervene in the situation. "Maybe this isn't necessary." "No," Kane cut him off harshly. "I'm curious. Can Range Girl shoot? Or does she only know about setting up targets?" The nickname Range Girl made the other operators laugh more. Sarah now had a nickname, but not the kind to be proud of. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as they reached for the rifle. But at that moment, when she took the rifle in her hands, everything changed. It was like being struck by electricity. The familiar weight, familiar balance, familiar feeling. The sensation she had missed, fled from, and tried to forget for 2 years. Sarah's posture changed imperceptibly. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, her feet spread shoulder-width apart. She held the rifle in a professional manner, as if she had been doing it every day for years. Left hand supporting the barrel, right hand gripping the stock, finger waiting in the trigger guard. Kane's smile slowly began to disappear. Sarah's way of holding the weapon, her stance, however much her hands trembled, she knew very well what to do and where to place everything. "The farthest target," Kane said challengingly, with some worry now in his voice. 2,100 meters. I bet you can't even see that distance." Sarah raised her head and looked at the distant target, the small metal plate behind the mist veil, wavering in the scorching heat of the desert. An impossible target. A distance none of them had been able to hit today, difficult even for professional snipers. But for Sarah, it was a familiar distance. She quietly moved to the shooting position. On the ground, stabilized position. Left elbow resting on the ground, right foot slightly open, body aligned with the target. Classic sniper position. She regulated her breathing. She felt the weight of the rifle. She found her balance. After 2 years, reuniting with an old friend. She looked through the scope. The target appeared clear. 2,100 meters away, a metal plate. A difficult target even under ideal conditions. But for Sarah, these weren't ideal conditions. Automatic calculations began in her mind. Wind, variable, 5 to 12 miles per hour range, northwest direction. Wind direction changes at half the target distance. Temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, density effect present. Humidity, 15%, low humidity increases bullet velocity. Barometric pressure, 29.85 inches of mercury, lower than sea level, affects bullet flight path. Mirage effect, medium intensity, shifts target 2 to 3 minutes of angle upward. Gravity effect, approximately 65 feet drop at 2,100 meters. Coriolis effect, minimal but must be accounted for. All in her mind, automatic calculations, the result of years of training, thousands of shots, like a human calculator. She took a breath, exhaled half. In the world, there was only her and the target. The sounds around her ceased. Time stopped. She slowly pulled the trigger. The rifle fired. When the bullet left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second, it continued on its path through the desert air with perfect spiral rotation. It passed through wind layers, overcame temperature changes, fought against gravity. 3 seconds later, the target 2,100 meters away rang out. Dead center. Complete silence on the range. Kane was frozen, scope in his hand, still looking at the target. The other operators looked at each other in astonishment. Torres stared at Sarah with his mouth open. Wilson couldn't believe his eyes. Sarah handed the rifle back to Kane, showing no sign of pride or boasting. "Thank you," she said quietly, and began to walk away. "Wait," Kane called out, now with a completely different tone in his voice. "How did that happen?" Sarah stopped, turned around. For the first time, she was really looking at him. She was no longer afraid. "Lucky shot," she said calmly. "Lucky shot? A perfect center hit from 2,100 meters? A shot of this level can only be made by elite snipers." Rodriguez intervened in the situation, admiration in his voice. "Sir, this shot, I couldn't even make a shot of this level. Who is this woman?" Kane began reassessing Sarah. Her stance, the way she held the weapon, her pre-shot routine, breath control, trigger pull. These weren't movements expected from a civilian technician. These were the movements of someone who had trained for years and been tested in the field of battle. "Who are you?" Kane asked, this time with a respectful tone. Sarah paused for a moment. She didn't want to reveal the identity she had protected for 2 years, but she no longer had a choice. "Former Marine sniper," she said quietly. "Sarah Mitchell. Service number classified, operational history classified." Complete silence. Torres stepped forward, his eyes wide. "Classified operational history?" Sarah nodded. Understanding dawned on Kane's face. Are you a real operative?" "Former." "Why are you here? Why are you working as a technician? With your skills, you could find work anywhere." Sarah remained silent for a long time. The pain of the past appeared in her eyes. Then she approached and made eye contact with Kane. "Because sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. And because I can't pull the trigger anymore." "Can't? You just made a perfect shot. On targets, yes. On people, no." It took time to understand the meaning. Kane slowly realized. PTSD. War trauma. This woman had seen many things in war, done many things, and returned wounded. The next day, Sarah arrived early as usual, but this time was different. Kane and his team were already waiting for her. "Good morning, Sarah," Kane greeted respectfully. He was using her name for the first time. "Good morning, Lieutenant. If you'd like, we'd like to learn your shooting techniques, just technical knowledge, no pressure." Sarah looked around. The men who had humiliated her the day before were now approaching her with respect. "Okay," she said, "I'll teach." And so, Sarah Mitchell's new life began. She learned that she couldn't escape her past, but she could make peace with it. Because some talents never disappear, they just sleep, waiting for the right moment.